Manufacturing our efficient engineering conversation today. If you guys missed the post early in the day, we're going to talk to Nick in just a couple of minutes. Nick is I'm probably going to butcher this, but Nick is one of the co-founders, co-creators of Node-RED. Now, 10 years later, he is working, he has started a company, and they are working to bring Node-RED to a more industrialized platform. But those are my words, not Nick's. We'll give it about 2 more minutes, and we will go ahead and let Nick say that in his own words, and hopefully better words than the words that I have just had. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you are new here, we are a very open, kind of fun conversation show. Over the course of the next 60 to 75 minutes, we'll chat with Nick. If you guys have questions and comments, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We will do our very best to go ahead and bring those questions and comments to the chat as possible. And then if we don't have the opportunity to get to them, we will do our very best to make sure those get answered after the show. I do want to make a special announcement. Automate is less than 2 weeks away. So 2 weeks from today, the day that you guys are potentially watching this live, Vlad and I will be at the Siemens booth at Automate, doing live shows and having a bunch of conversations. I made the note of these. So the Siemens booth is booth 3618. So we will be at booth 3618 all of Wednesday. We'll have a live show there. We are going to have some behind the scenes stuff that I'm not really sure that we can talk about yet. In fact, I'm not really sure we're supposed to be able to talk about it at the show, but no one has told me, Dave, don't talk about this yet. So there'll be some behind the scenes stuff that we will absolutely go ahead and have fun with, which overall should be good. Vlad and I, Manufacturing Hub, will be at the show all week long. We'll be at the Siemens booth. We'll be at the Festo booth. We'll be at the Phoenix Contact booth. We'll be kind of all over the place, seeing everyone. It should be good. If you guys want to meet us in person or see us again in person, if you know us, please feel free to come up. We will be sure to go ahead and post where we are going to be across all of that. Very excited for that. Without further ado, officially everyone, welcome to Manufacturing Hub. My name is Dave. This guy down here is Vlad, and we're very excited to continue our efficient engineering conversation sponsored by Siemens. Our guest this week is Nick O'Leary. Nick, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, guys. It's great to be here.
Really appreciate you joining us today, Nick. I think it's going to be a great conversation. As Dave has mentioned a little bit off stream, we both made some posts about Node-RED. There's been certainly an interesting bit of discussion going on, so I'm looking forward to diving into that conversation. But before we do that, could you give us a bit of a background, Nick? How did you get started in software? How did you build out Node-RED? And ultimately give us some information about what it is that you're building today.
Well, of course. My career has been a fairly simple one, or it's a short list, as in that I joined IBM straight from university as a software developer, and found myself working in IBM across quite a wide variety of roles, mostly on the software engineering side of the house, working on product, doing customer solution engineering type stuff, but really getting stuck into lots of different things. And I found myself working alongside Andy Stanford-Clark, who is one of the co-creators of MQTT. And in fact, I was working on one of our MQTT implementations, sort of a very small messaging broker. And this is before MQTT is known outside of IBM, for where it's got to today. So through that, I got very much involved with what we would now know as IoT, but back then that term wasn't really, hadn't been coined necessarily, or hadn't been broadly recognized at that point. But doing a lot of work on MQTT, and through that got involved. I'm part of the OASIS Standards Committee for MQTT, so spent a lot of time in standards committees talking through how we standardize MQTT and getting that through the process, both the original version 3, which was kind of the version everyone knew, and this was kind of the ratification of that standard, but then also moving on to, okay, now we've ratified what everyone's using, let's improve it, and spent a couple of years working in the standards committee towards MQTT v5. So, but the point being, a lot of time spent thinking about low-level messaging, edge of network stuff, IoT type scenarios, and just through that, I ended up in the emerging technologies group at IBM, which was a very atypical group for a company like IBM, in that it was a group whose remit was to do interesting projects for customers. So this wasn't services in the sense of, go build an ERP system for this customer type of thing. It was very much a customer would come to us with a problem, and it would be, let's find some innovative way of solving it. Typically proof of concept type stuff. We will have 1 week, 2 weeks just to build do some innovation around that problem. And because of my MQTT background, I was getting involved with a number of, again, IoT type projects, some in the manufacturing space, which I'll come back to once I've got to the Node-RED part of the story. But the great thing about that role was, yes, it was a services role, but we weren't there to be like 90% utilized, 100% utilized. Our goal was to be about 50% utilized. Basically, half your time doing client work and half your time learning or innovating, because if we're doing emerging technologies, we have to stay on top of what's emerging and do the innovation. So it was in this context of, I was sort of between client projects and my background doing a lot of MQTT like messaging. I had tried a few years earlier thinking, well, so the product, the MQTT product I had been working on, you could set up mapping. So when an MQTT message comes in on one topic, you could write some code to make it get republished on a different topic. But it was all code driven and it was a real pain to use and just wasn't user friendly. And at that time I thought, wouldn't it be neat? What's the visualization of this? And wouldn't there be a more accessible way to configure your broker to do these mappings just by drawing a visualization? And I did some experimenting back then, but browser technology wasn't the sorts of visualizations you could do in the browser. It was just clunky and wasn't that fun. Anyway, fast forward to when I was in the emerging technology role, I thought that this idea came back to me, and I thought, well, a couple of years on, the sorts of visualizations you can do in a browser have leaps and bounds beyond what it had been 3-4 years earlier. And I started playing around with this idea of, okay, let's visualize mapping between MQTT topics, and imagine a workspace where you can drag on a node that represents an MQTT topic and then draw a wire to another node that is a different MQTT topic. So it was a very simple proof of concept, and I wrote a bit of code on the back end to actually make it do something. And I showed it to my colleague, and who had been, again, very involved in the MQTT world. And he was like, that's great. Can I use it tomorrow as a client project? Because he was about to go off and start a new project, and he knew he was going to be getting thrown random sensor data from lots of different devices and need to very quickly organize it and get it all mapped. And so that happened. And then a day or two later, he said, well, they've given me a serial device. So I'm getting data over serial, not MQTT. Could we have a node that can pull data off a serial port? And I was like, okay, well, I knocked one of those up and added that into the mix. And I mean, I think it's not really for the first sort of month, every day or two, a client project came up with a need for a different type of data source. And it just seemed, well, it just makes sense. Let's add support for that, and let's add support. So we were, what became Node-RED was quite, started out as me just wanting to play around with this idea of mapping topics, and just very quickly became something that was actually pretty useful for actual paid work and the sorts of client projects that the team were doing. And we then sort of took a step back and thought, right, let's let's now make this a bit more structured and rework the code base from this very rapid prototyping mode we were in, and made it much more easier to write extra nodes rather than it all being hard coded in and all this sort of stuff. And that was kind of the genesis of Node-RED. It was literally within days of me playing around with a prototype to it being used in a proof of concept for a client, and it just evolved super quickly. And then a great example in the manufacturing space was I ended up doing a client project for a food manufacturer that wanted to instrument a production line with a whole bunch of sensors. And this was in their development factory. It wasn't live, but they wanted to be able to do some data analysis on, I think, could they predict quality drops based on sensor data of different things happening on the line type of stuff. So we turned up with a box full of Raspberry Pis and a whole bunch of sensors, and we worked with the engineer on the floor, literally zip tying sensors and all sorts of things, all coming back to some Raspberry Pis, gathering the data. And we just, we needed a quick and easy way to gather the data. So we put Node-RED on each of these Pis, created some flows that, when sort of the line, each time the line progressed, it would just trigger gathering data from all these sensors. Now, and then we could squirt that data up to a database, and then the big heavy IBM software could do the data analysis. That was all grand. And that was fun. And it's a few days in a ice cream factory. Sort of not the Willy Wonka image you may have, although there were pipes with chocolate running through. But it was much more industrial than Roald Dahl would have you think. But then the real value came. But this factory was like a 5-hour drive away from where we're based. So we'd done all the planning. We'd gone up for one day, did the fit out, got it working, and then a few days later we got a call saying they'd had to swap out one of the sensors, and now the voltage it was sending back mapped to a different pressure range, or I forget what the sensor was. So it was like, when can you guys come back up to rebuild, to reconfigure the system? Whilst I was on the phone with this guy, I connected to the VPN, opened up Node-RED in my browser, and as soon as he had told me the numbers over the phone, I just updated the numbers in software and I hit deploy, and I told him, you're good to go. That we don't need to arrange a site visit. It's all updated. And we could then show them how to do that, because they're engineers building manufacturing lines. They're not software engineers, but they understand PLC systems, and they can understand. Well, it meant the system we'd put in for them wasn't a big black box of IBM software. It was actually, no, you just point a web browser at here, and they could instantly understand in the low-code environment of Node-RED the relationship between the sensor and the data it's producing, and how to manage that data. So that was really cool. And again, just testament to the value we were finding for ourselves in Node-RED. Then IBM being IBM, we want to take a moment to think, okay, what do we do next? This is a super useful project that we're using. What's its future, and what path we want to take? Now, I've long been a big open source advocate, doing a lot of open source MQTT work already. And to me, it just felt like, this is either going to be an IBM product or it's going to be an open source project. And it was clear where we weren't positioned well in the company to convince anyone to turn it into a product. And also it was at that point, it was a novel little tool, didn't really align with IBM strategic solutions type of stuff. And it kind of made sense. And we got, having been told it could take up to like 3 months to get approval to open source it, a lot of stars aligned, and it took 6 days to get the approval, and which is pure luck on scheduling in terms of the board that would meet to give these approvals happened to be meeting, in 5 days after we applied, and we got on the agenda, and I think yes, it was some effort, just satisfy all the sort of requirements. Again, this was 10 years ago, when open source was. IBM is a huge open source contributor. It is one of the largest historically, but at that time it wasn't evenly distributed, shall we say, within the company. So there were some areas of the company who really understood open source, made huge contributions to the Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, all that sort of stuff. But I think the product areas were perhaps a little more guarded, shall we say. Anyway, we got the approvals. I
have a question.
Yeah.
If I can ask a question, on open source specifically, because I think that topic is coming up more and more in the industrial space, but I certainly wouldn't say that even I have a deep understanding of what happens when a company like IBM decides to open source a project.
Mm-hmm.
And, at this time, at least, from what I see from the outside, there's certainly many different branches that spun off of Node-RED specifically. But could you walk us through, from that moment that IBM decides to open source it, what really happens? Does that mean that IBM ceases support of the product? Does that mean they assign certain engineers to support it? Can anyone pull branches without any license agreements? How does that kind of shape up?
So for us, because we weren't a product team open sourcing something, we were this services group who had created this asset. I think it was slightly easier to navigate some of those questions. But the requirements were, what license are you going to open source it as, and what are the terms and conditions of support, all that sort of stuff. I think a lot of it was, are you going to cause IBM trouble by open sourcing this? But no, I think it was clear we open source it as Apache 2, which is a well liked and favorable license for open sourcing. Very favorable to commercial use, so it doesn't restrict people from that regard. And there are many other open source licenses which would have done just as well a job, but we went with Apache 2, and it was done on the understanding that we are going to continue developing it ourselves. I mean, there was no financial commitment from IBM, and I think that's. I was fortunately in a position where we'd created Node-RED as kind of a side project to our day jobs, and our day jobs had enabled us to keep developing it in service of the day job. I think we got fortunate. We got appropriate support from the right places within the company, that they recognized what was happening in the open source community around Node-RED. And I managed to get myself a role in the open source developer advocacy organization, which again gave me kind of the cover to keep working on Node-RED whilst using it as part of our developer advocacy work for the broader IBM. Because you could use Node-RED to demo all sorts of IBM cloud services super easily, and it sort of worked really well for that side. If you want to get a room full of people started using what's an AI solution is the one that people wanted pushing at that time, we could create a workshop that used Node-RED. Participants wouldn't have to spend their time figuring out lines of code. You could build a solution that showed value super easily. So that managed to get me in a position within the company that doing developer advocacy, it gave me the cover to continue working on Node-RED, which was super fortunate. And I still it's one of those, when I look back, I recognize how super lucky I was to find myself in that position. Effectively, I turned a personal side project into my day job at a company like IBM, which doesn't happen generally. That it was, and again, I think it just comes down to I got good support from good people within the company who recognized the value, and Yeah, and it wasn't always straightforward maintaining that balance, but it certainly got me to where we are. And so IBM contributed Node-RED to the JS Foundation, as it was then, now the OpenJS Foundation, which was a key step because being part of a foundation means puts open governance around the project. So it stopped being IBM's Node-RED. So it was no longer a project solely owned and controlled by IBM, even as an open source project. It was not owned by IBM anymore. Part of the OpenJS Foundation, which is much more, as I say, about governance. So who gets a say in what happens in the project? How do you manage? Who makes key decisions? That type of stuff. And that I certainly think has been one of the certainly in the more commercial space, one of the things that has helped Node-RED get adopted by commercial users, because they recognize it isn't a single vendor solution that they're investing. It is an open source project with open governance around it. So that's...
And how does it work? Sorry again, like Nick, to interrupt. And again, maybe a basic question for you, but if I was to develop a node for Node-RED and I submit a node that then, like, who oversees that? Hey, that is a great addition. Let's push that into the official release. How does that process work if someone wants to get involved in the project,
Sure.
let's say today?
So for those who aren't familiar with Node-RED, it is based around this idea of a workspace where you drag nodes on that represent different bits of functionality, and you draw wires which represent the flow of information between those. One of the key things we did very early on in the project is we recognized it wasn't sustainable to just add every node we needed into the core of Node-RED. We needed to make it so that it was extensible, that people could write their own nodes and install it for themselves without us having to gatekeep what gets in and what doesn't. So that's something we built in very early on in the life of the project. And there's over 4,200 third-party nodes in the community. So these nodes people self-publish and they add to the community library. It means, we as in the core of Node-RED there's no gatekeeping, there's no blocking, or we do keep an eye on making sure good quality stuff rises to the top and all that sort of stuff. But we built it as an open platform so people can write their own nodes and either share them with the community or keep them to themselves. We don't mind. So that's an important part. So it's extensible, open and extensible, without having to push things always into the core. In terms of then people wanting to contribute new features and that type of stuff, again, we have an open development process. People can, via the forums, propose features. We can discuss them. I think one of the things historically we've struggled a bit with is getting those feature requests to come with actual contributions to realize them. Yes. So we've got a very healthy wish list that are all good, all valid ideas, but in terms of actual pairs of hands writing lines of code to realize them, I think that's one of the areas where have been historically more constrained. So, but again, I do try and make sure we are open in the sense that if people want to get involved in the core development of Node-RED, that they can. I always try and make myself available and open to conversations, and try and work out if there are any barriers to people, or perceived barriers to people contributing to the core of Node-RED, or the bits around Node-RED that we manage within the Node-RED organization.
I would say, Nick, if I may ask one last open source question. So you, and especially being part of IBM, have gone down the open source route many times, right? So we had Arlen Nipper, the other co-inventor of MQTT, on. I think he was episode 67. I've said it enough times; it's now burned in my memory, and I don't have to look it up. But we had Arlen on. We didn't really. I think we might have kind of breezed over the open source, and they went with the Eclipse Foundation, or I guess IBM went with the Eclipse Foundation for that. I guess I would imagine most of our listeners are not familiar, have never gone through the process of open sourcing.
Mhm.
But if an organization has a piece of software that they're working on, and the option is, hey, do we build this as an internal tool, or do we go down the open source route? Based upon your experience working with a huge contributor, what are some good reasons or some good whys to open source a tool as opposed to keep it all to themselves?
I just like the idea of sharing, yeah, and of if it's good, I want other people to benefit. I mean, it's slightly altruistic in the sense of it's a useful tool, and yeah, certainly with Node-RED back then, the thinking was very much we weren't in a position to commercialize it, so the choice was it sits on a shelf gathering dust, apart from when we use it in client projects, and it may just reach a natural end of stopping being useful because we're pulled onto other things, or you open source it and you still develop it, but with the added benefit that if you find a community of interested users, if you find one other person who is inspired by it and wants to give back and finds bugs because they're using it in ways that you hadn't imagined but are perfectly valid bugs to hit, it just raises the boat of quality of what you're producing. And yeah, I think that's it's quite an idealistic mode. Yeah. Certainly it then gets a challenge around when you then want to think about commercializing, which is kind of the sort of the second half of perhaps of the Node-RED story now, that having developed as open source, built this huge community around it, 2 years ago now, I found myself in a position where an opportunity arose to leave IBM and start a company around Node-RED. And so that's what I did. So just over 2 years ago now, I founded FlowForge, which is, we're an open core company, by which we mean the software we're building in FlowForge is itself open source, or at least open core. And it's really based on this idea of, well, having seen how Node-RED is being used and how it's being adopted, looking at some of those barriers that the more commercial and enterprise users have experienced trying to adopt Node-RED on a more formal basis. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of the stuff, because in the Node-RED project, we've focused very much on it's the Node-RED runtime and just concern ourselves with the application you built in Node-RED. But when you want to move into a more enterprise environment, whether it's manufacturing, industrial, or any other industry, but an organization where you have a CIO or an IT department who cares about the software you're running in your environment, what can you do just to make it easier and just super simple to manage Node-RED within your organization? So how you manage access control, how you manage updates, how you can bring some of those DevOps type software practices of having test environments, deploying to production, all those sorts of workflows. How can we bring those sorts of qualities to the Node-RED environment? And also recognizing, for a lot of companies who, I'm sure you've seen Node-RED everywhere when you go to events like the Hanover Mess and things like that. Often that's Node-RED has come about because developers like ourselves have installed it and have done something useful with it. And you always get to that point where you then want to speak to your boss and saying, look, this is super useful. Can we roll it out wider? And then it's those sorts of questions of, okay, who's going to support it? Who do we phone when something goes wrong? Or, how do we integrate it with our security policies? All the sort of SOC 2, ISO 27001, all those sorts of, there's a whole lot of boring stuff you have to do when you want to bring software into environments. And really, we want to solve those problems with FlowForge and build a platform that makes it super easy to manage Node-RED at scale, whilst also recognizing we want to keep Node-RED developing, keep progressing with the core of Node-RED as the OpenJS project, and being open with that and bringing it forward. So that's where I find myself now after a couple of years. We're building this platform, and yeah, we have certainly honed in the manufacturing and industrial IoT type space for where we're sort of more focused with the FlowForge platform, looking at the sorts of solutions that people want to build in that space and some of their challenges around managing Node-RED.
Interesting.
Nick, we do have a couple of questions in chat, but while we're still on the topic of FlowForge, I do want to answer Matt's question.
Oh,
So
yes.
he made a comment saying, as someone unfamiliar with FlowForge and just quickly reading over it, is it pushing containers down to the devices, or is it updating the flows running on the device locally?
It pushes the flows down to the device. So we have a little device agent that you run on the device that connects back to the platform. And then, when you want to push out flows, you can, so you develop your flows in a sort of cloud environment. You can then create a snapshot of those flows saying, yep, I'm happy with that. And then you can push that snapshot out to all of the devices connected to that application. So if you've got, you might have a particular application in your environment, you might have, you want to deploy the same set of flows out to multiple devices because they're all talking to the same sorts of hardware, that sort of use case. So so we push flows down to the device agent rather than full-blown containers.
Interesting.
I would say,
Go ahead, Dave.
Matt's got another question. We've got a couple of questions. Can you, maybe for people who are unfamiliar with Node-RED, to know the difference between Node-RED and what you guys are doing, open coring, FlowForge, can you give just everyone the quick 30-second rundown of what Node-RED is kind of overall as a package and where everything lives, and then what you guys are doing to, I'm just going to use the word industrialize with FlowForge, please.
No, absolutely. So think of Node-RED as this integration runtime. It's a single process runtime that you can run on a device, in the cloud, wherever you want. And it gives you the editor as well as that runtime piece that lets you build your application, deploy it, and it just runs as a process on that device, doing whatever work your flows define. So that is essentially Node-RED. So then with FlowForge, we're thinking, okay, what happens if I've now got within my environment 100 Node-RED instances all doing different things, or I want to have an environment where someone can just spin up a new Node-RED to do some new piece of processing in the environment type of thing. So that's kind of what FlowForge is. It's how you manage lots of individual Node-REDs, which could be running in the FlowForge platform, or it could be running on remote devices outside of the immediate bounds of our platform that connect back. And I said we are building FlowForge as it is an open core piece of software. So we have FlowForge Cloud, which is us running our own software that people can sign up to today and get Node-RED running in the cloud and connect devices and experience the platform. But people can also install the whole FlowForge platform for themselves within their own environment, whether it's within their own AWS account or even on a server on the factory floor, whatever's suitable. So they can actually manage it entirely for themselves there. So FlowForge is about managing those Node-RED instances and how you sort of distribute the flows to devices and manage what's running where. That's the, hopefully that helps delineate the two. But we kind of want to make FlowForge a super simple way for people to run Node-RED without having to manually manage it for themselves, type of thing.
Okay. I like that. And so, excuse me. So Matt has a follow-up question asking what happens when the device doesn't have the correct version of the node installed.
Yep. So the bearing in mind, we are developing iteratively and things evolve, but with the current device agent, whenever new flows are pushed down, it does check the modules, what's installed, what does it need to have installed, and it will attempt to install the modules that are needed by whatever's just been pushed down. So right now there is it does some dependency management as part of that. It does assume the device has access to the public npm repository on the internet, but we also recognize that's not always an option in industrial environments. So that is something we're looking at. We've done some work to a customer of ours has exactly that problem, that their factory floor is on a closed network. It can't reach out, or it's very selective as to what parts of the internet it can reach out to. But for them, they have a very stable standard image of what Node-RED looks like. So they have pre-built a container with all of the modules they want pre-installed, and they've pushed that out to their devices themselves, but including our device agent. And then so our device agent is then configured. Don't worry about installing extra stuff, just assume stuff has been installed. And so you can then manage the flows. And for that customer, that has solved the problem because it fits in with their existing workflow of using containers to manage the software on those devices. But I think it's an area that there's plenty of scope to evolve, and ultimately we're developing the open. We're keen to get that feedback from real users as to what sorts of solutions work for them.
Nick, I want to ask you, and I think we can certainly go down the path of these very technical questions, but I do want to kind of step back a little bit just for a moment. And I know that Node-RED is not primarily built for the manufacturing sector, right? There's a lot of different nodes that can be applied in a lot of different industries. So I'm curious, again, since you have a lot of visibility on how it is used, what are maybe like other use cases, or what are other kind of ways people are using Node-RED outside of manufacturing?
Yeah, it certainly has. It has found a home across a wide variety. Certainly, the IoT space is kind of its, and sort of the industrial manufacturing. Anything interacting with things does tend to be its natural home. But I've seen fascinating use cases around. Well, in fact, there was a company who used it as part of a. I'm just trying to find the right words for this because I haven't described it out loud for a while. They built AI services for online gaming chat services. So they built systems that would analyze all the chat going on in a game to look for misbehavior by people playing it. And they integrated Node-RED for their analysts to build all the sort of the AI models of detecting different types of speech and the different patterns that they wanted to detect. And again, a great example of their users weren't programmers, they were linguists. They were people who understood language and understood how to do text analysis, that type of stuff. And Node-RED made it super easy for them to build the sort of logical flow of how to detect types of language. Well, that's one example. We've seen it used in banking. We've seen it used in insurance companies using it for interesting. Again, those tend to be sort of gathering sensor data for doing interesting things with dynamic insurance policies type stuff. I've seen it. There's. I see that message from Sean. Yeah, so this is one close to my heart. There's a clothing company on the Isle of Wight, which small island off the south coast of the UK, near where I live, who do t-shirt printing and clothes printing, that type of stuff. And they've built a system where people can actually create their own online store with all their own designs and all this sort of stuff. Their entire factory is automated through Raspberry Pis running Node-RED. So all of the sort of the picking machines for you need prints barcodes that they can scan, and then on a Node-RED dashboard it tells them which bin to put this T-shirt that's just been printed, and it's really cool to see. And we went and did a factory visit there a few years ago, and the system has grown, and they've got like dozens of Raspberry Pis around the place. But they had one in the middle of the factory floor, which was an old supermarket. So they had built this up. Their factory was an old supermarket, which was really weird because it was a supermarket I shopped in when I was on holiday there a couple of years earlier. Which, anyway, but just hanging in the middle on a column was a Raspberry Pi hanging off its Ethernet connection with a sticker saying, "Do not unplug." And he assured me that wasn't, and that was no longer the heart of the factory. It had been for a time, but they realized they shouldn't really have the central nervous system of their factory just hanging off its Ethernet cable in the middle of the factory floor. But they had left it there as kind of a tribute to where they had begun. But
I really like that. I think we need to send Dave to this factory for a couple of months and maybe sell him on the idea of implementing that way.
So
he'll continue his projects on Raspberry Pis.
So I was going to say, I'm over here, and I don't think I've ever been more triggered in any conversation I've ever had than Sean asking that question. I feel like Sean specifically asked that question because he knew how I would feel about that. So first, thank you, Sean. We do have some more questions, but before we've got some questions, we've got some people to thank, right? So we would like to thank Siemens for sponsoring this entirety of the, efficient engineering theme. And before we get into talking a little bit about this, again, we want to remind you that Vlad and myself and, I don't know, a few tens of thousands of other people will be at Automate in 2 weeks, starting May 22nd through the 25th. We will be at the Siemens booth 3618 for all of Wednesday, and we'll probably be in and out for a good chunk of that. We'll also be at a bunch of other booths. So if you're going to be at Automate, be sure to stop by Siemens and be sure to go find us to come say hi, to come get some stickers, and to do all of those other things. But with that, we want to again thank Siemens for sponsoring this, and the potential of automation to eliminate repetitive and low-value tasks is quite significant. And the engineering tasks are no exception. In its report, Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained, What the Future of Work Will Mean for Job Skills and Wages, the McKinsey Global Institute found that an 8-hour workday being the norm, the average employee loses up to 60 hours per month of easily automated tasks, which is 1/3 of their time. Innovative companies like Siemens have been making great strides in topics for interdisciplinary collaboration, modularization, automated engineering, openness, and validation and testing. If you'd like to unlock efficient engineering workflows, check out the link in the description today. Again, we want to thank Siemens for sponsoring this, the entirety of the theme, for all of their continued support, and I assume like a big old pile of Siemens swag that they're going to give Vlad so he can go put up in the wall behind him. And if you guys are listening in podcast form and you haven't seen the wall of technology behind Vlad, you guys are absolutely missing out. Maybe for the next big episode, we'll show you the floor of PLCs that Vlad has to gingerly step over every day in order to get to the desk in front of that wall. But no, so Nick, I love this conversation. We had a question kind of earlier in the show from AJ, and he wants to know, is there any specific pattern that has emerged or become popular from Node-RED applied to manufacturing, kind of a reusable framework? And then I guess I'd love to know that, and then kind of based upon that, are you guys basing what you guys are doing with FlowForge or the concept of FlowForge around any pattern that you've seen emerge?
So I think broadly, one of the most common things we are seeing Node-RED get used for is around sort of the dashboarding side and the visualization of data. Node-RED is great for pulling in the data and transforming it, sending off somewhere else, doing that sort of integration work. But a super common pattern we see is the fact it lets you just throw up a data dashboard on your factory floor wherever you need it. A Raspberry Pi plugged into a TV, and you can just throw up whatever information, whatever data visualization you want super quickly and change it really rapidly. So having that sort of really adaptable data visualization on the dashboarding side is certainly something we have seen a fair amount of, but we certainly also hear the Node-RED dashboarding story. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, it's an area that we need to do some work in the ongoing roadmap of Node-RED, in terms of the existing Node-RED dashboard is kind of reaching the end of its legs in terms of the software stack underneath it, and so that's something we're looking at closely with what we can do in FlowForge in terms of is that something we can help reinvigorate and bring, because we so often the feedback we hear is the dashboarding side is so valuable in what you can do with Node-RED. In terms of other general patterns, I think it would be hard to distill it down to anything. I think we see the types of things people are doing are similar, but everyone has their own sort of way of approaching it, if that makes sense. It's a lot about Node-RED letting you, with its vast palette of nodes, integrates with so many. There are OPC nodes, there are Modbus nodes, there's nodes for all sorts of different PLCs that people have created in the community. So using Node-RED as a way that can pull data from all these different sources in ways that those device manufacturers aren't always necessarily keen, should we say, that the data should get broken out of their closed platform, but the fact that Node-RED can really help you pull your data from lots of disparate sources and start getting that insight that by pulling different bits of data, and you can be so ad hoc about it. You can just experiment, saying, "Oh, what if we pull information from that line in? Can we get any extra insights from there?" And Node-RED just makes it easy to experiment and find what's useful, and be much more. I don't want to say ad hoc is the wrong word for it, but just being much more situational. You realize, perhaps a line is running slowly. You're not sure why. Just throw some Node-RED flows together that just capture some data, and you can just monitor something and can you spot any patterns, that type of stuff. This isn't a software solution you're going to then run for 2 years. It might just be, I need this for a week just to monitor something, just to see, is there a problem, type of thing. So the speed with which Node-RED lets you build that sort of thing is hugely valuable. But
Nick, I had a question before the stream, which aligns a little bit, to the topic of scaling with manufacturing. And the question was, I think that a lot of people see Node-RED currently as, as an application, right? So you can certainly, as you've described, you can deploy that on a Raspberry Pi, you can deploy that on an IPC that runs Linux, you can put it in the cloud. But what about scaling that to maybe like an enterprise solution / platform, right? Do you see it becoming where, let's say Vlad is the corporate engineer, I'm telling, 10 different plans with, obviously IT guys deploy a server for me, I'm going to deploy Node-RED there, and I can orchestrate sort of a deployment across the entire enterprise, be able to pull data with it into a central location and sort of orchestrate more than just, hey, let's do this proof of concept on a Raspberry Pi. You know what I mean? Is there a road path that you see, or do you think that it will still kind of be this application, one-off solution? What are your thoughts on scalability in general?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Node-RED can absolutely play that role. I talk about sort of the ad hoc nature of it, but still, you can build long-running, scalable services in Node-RED. It sits just as well in that space. This is something we are looking at on the FlowForge side as well, in terms of how you can build scalability and high availability around Node-RED. So having multiple instances of Node-RED and being able to scale the workload across them, or having a hot spare instance that can spin up if a primary fails and take over the workload, those sorts of topics. So those are very active conversations and work we are exploring right now with FlowForge. And it's always an interesting balance between what's a core Node-RED capability versus something like FlowForge, which is more about orchestrating Node-RED. That said, I always say, don't underestimate what a single Node-RED can do. I think it is one of those. Yes, Node.js, the programming runtime that Node-RED is built on top of, it is a single-threaded runtime, but equally, for the right workloads, you'd be. I think people can underestimate how much you can push through. But also, I'd say in terms of patterns, again, this is very much coming with my MQTT background of don't build solutions that you try and get every piece of data back to a central point and do all your work on that data at the central point. It's do your work as close to where the data is produced as possible, and push up the insights, push up what the parse data, the knowledge that you can glean from the workload. So don't think of it as you have a single Node-RED in the cloud and all the data must hit it and it does all the work. Actually, we've got some Node-REDs right on the edge that are doing some local processing, and when they detect an interesting event, they send those events up, and it's almost like this tree of applications that so the workload at the core is actually much reduced because you've pushed more of the intelligence out towards the edge and made the edge nodes more autonomous in the work they're able to do. So I think it's that sort of, when we talk about patterns, it's that sort of thing around just thinking about where's the right place to process a piece of data, and it's always going to be as close to the point that data is produced as possible, because you don't want to waste time and energy moving that data any further than you really need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's going to be tons of variation in applications, verticals, right? Like industries. So I think it's certainly not a one size fits all answer, right? But I think it's going to be interesting to see if it will be possible. Like as an example, we mentioned that it's single threaded. Well, if there is someone who wants to scale that data from, let's say, 10 tags to 10,000 tags, can it automatically, spin up like extra instances that allow that flow to go through? And ultimately, as you've mentioned, also, if there is an instance that goes down, there is maybe like a backup that can automatically be replicated. And of course, that solution may not be needed at a very small factory that's running proof of concept applications, but someone who's looking to scale, it would be certainly something that they might consider, right? They might not even go with that solution if it doesn't provide some of those features. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Absolutely. And yeah, we recognize that very much so. And as I say, so the high availability and scalability is an important epic in our backlog at the moment. And yeah, we've got some iterative steps in that direction we're working on. So
interesting. We have a comment from Grayson Dawson. He said that my project uses Node-RED in industrial robotics. Thinking through scalability as an enterprise solution is on my mind. Great question. Would be interested in connecting with you all further. So definitely goes in line with what you just mentioned. I think it's going to be really interesting to see if we can manage those like rollouts more scalably.
Let me
Dave,
I was going to say, let me kind of follow up on that with a couple of questions, Nick. We talked about everything from this t-shirt manufacturing company running Node-RED on a Raspberry Pi, literally dangling from the Ethernet in the middle of the facility, to proof of concepts, which is kind of where it came from, which was a really good example, and kind of dashboards where it's built from. I guess the two-part question is, where do you see kind of in which part of the automation kind of roadmap, if you will, do you see people looking and leveraging Node-RED, and where in there are you looking to build FlowForge? What sort of solution? What sort of kind of prime customer do you imagine FlowForge will serve in the future?
For us, it's anyone who wants to manage Node-RED at scale within their environment, where they perhaps you're already seeing the value of Node-RED in your environment. So you understand what Node-RED is, you understand what it's capable of, but you're also now faced with the question of, okay, how can we manage this at scale, and how can we get it working where it isn't just that proof of concept on one line. It's actually now we've got 200 instances we need because of the size of our facility or facilities across across multiple sites type of thing. So we have seen people tackle that and take on board the orchestration side for themselves, and frankly that isn't their core business. They're not there to build an orchestration platform for Node-RED. So I think that's kind of where FlowForge steps in and wants to, is the natural space to stepping in for helping people. Node-RED has such a huge and varied user community. A lot of home automation. We've just recently finished our second survey of the community, which we're just about to publish the results of. But seeing a large swathe of sort of the individual hobbyist home automation type user, but certainly seeing a growth in industrial use and sort of quote unquote professional use. There's that's only growing, that sort of desire to run Node-RED in real environments. And yes, it started out as a tool for doing proof of concepts and that sort of quick agile type work, but it's long been the case that there's so much production work running through Node-REDs in the world today that it is people shouldn't be writing it off as only good for POCs type of stuff. I mean, another use case without, I cannot name names, but there are theme parks in the world where as you walk around with a wristband to interact with stuff, every time you tap in with that wristband, you are interacting with Node-RED. And this is a theme park, a well-known theme park around the world type of thing. So there are big serious uses of Node-RED out there in the wild, doing real things that we don't see. and that it's always what my as the lead quote unquote of the Node-RED project, I have conversations like this all the time, and people say, oh, tell us, where have you seen Node-RED, what types of things? And I always say, well, I always turn it around also to the audience and say, look, if you've got a cool story about Node-RED, please tell me, because I see so much of what people do when they share it in the community forum, and that type of stuff. I love to hear the stories of how people are using Node-RED. So if people watching this, listen to this, have some cool Node-RED stories, then please do share, because again, I just know it's being used far wider than I'm aware of, or I come across. And like I said, Hanover Mess, I wasn't there, colleagues were, I know you guys were. The amount of Node-RED you could just see as you walked around the floor was just incredible, and real validation for what we've built. So.
And I will maybe throw down the gauntlet that Dave and I would also be very interested in seeing, factories that utilize Node-RED at the scale that Nick, you described in the UK. I think that's a really interesting use case, certainly. But we do have a few questions coming in. I don't want to bombard you with, technicalities of Node-RED. People are certainly interested, and we will have links to Nick's profile if he chooses to accept all the questions coming in from the audience. You can certainly reach out to him directly. But Nick, I certainly am very excited to see what FlowForge grows out to be. I think that it certainly has a lot of merit and a lot of applications in our space. Is there something that I want to ask you in general? Like, are you excited on a particular solution that it might solve? Are you having some thoughts of, hey, this might be a really cool feature, and I'm looking forward, maybe it's in 2 years that it will be developed? I'm curious to get your I'm sure that you have plenty of ideas and you discuss them with your team, but are there any specific things that stand out in your mind that will be really interesting for us to see and kind of ponder, as we wait for them to be released?
So I think the one that always springs to mind, because it's it's like the two things that spring to mind, and I'm sure if I delay any longer, I'll think of at least 5 more. But collaborative editing in Node-RED. So try and get that Google Docs experience where you can actually have 2 people collaborate in real time on building the application, and actually see what each other's doing, that type of collaborative development. And I think that's a lot of what we want to help with the FlowForge, is that team collaborative development of flows. So that's one area. There are conversations in the community dating back quite a while now, but that's something I'm excited to see. The other one, which I think is quite important for more commercial and enterprise level adoption, is testing and having a better, essentially, what is a test framework for a low code application, where it's all well and good building your application, drag and drop, describe your flows, but how do you test it, and how do you validate it's good? In software development, in lines of code development, you'd be quite used to writing test cases, and you'd have some process that runs all the test cases and validates and all that sort of stuff. What's the equivalent in a low code environment? How do you build low code tests? So I think that's again, it's an area we've had sort of a long running conversation on in the Node-RED community and with some contributors, but it's one I think is one of those missing pieces when you look across lots of low code environments, being able to say, not only here's my low code application, but here are the tests that I can run to validate what it's doing and that it's behaving as I expect, type of thing. So I think that's super interesting. On the FlowForge side, we are doing more and more on the DevOps side. So getting away from this idea of, okay, you've developed some flows here, I've now got to copy and paste the configuration between Node-REDs to push it into production, and looking at the automation we can bring to that. I think that's going to really make a difference to bringing some, again, in no way wanting to malign the approach, but it's bringing some more rigorous software engineering practice to a low code environment, keeping in mind though that the people creating these flows, one of the values of Node-RED is the people creating the flows aren't necessarily software engineers who are seeped in this idea of test cases, of all that sort of stuff. How can we keep bring those ideals to a low code environment that is accessible to the broad range of audience of Node-RED users?
Interesting.
Dave, what are your thoughts?
I like this, and I kind of want to transition this into the normal question that I ask about the future. But Nick, I feel like you've answered most of the what do you hope to see within the Node-RED ecosystem in the future. So let me kind of broaden to the what do you expect to see either with open source tools or with adoption of a variety of these different tools in the next 2 to 3 years within the industrial manufacturing realm?
I think it's super hard to say, but I think historically my perception, and I will say this, my background isn't seeped in industry and manufacturing, so this is kind of what I've seen as a sort of, I won't say outsider, but my perception from the conversations I've had with the people who are doing the day-to-day work in these environments is, I think I certainly get the sense there is the adoption of bringing open source to these sorts of environments is there is a lag in sort of the manufacturing industry. I think a lot of the traditional PLC manufacturers and the hardware manufacturers have benefited from, and they've liked having their ecosystem of solution that all plays nicely together, but you kind of invest in it wholesale. I think the ability for open source to help break down some of those barriers is super exciting, and I think whether this is naive or not, starting to see some of these manufacturers be more open and recognize that Node-RED and other tools, Node-RED isn't the only option, but open source isn't going to go away, and if we can get more investment from some of those manufacturers into building an ecosystem and being a participant in that ecosystem, I think is going to be super helpful. I mean, one of my, as a project lead on Node-RED, trying to think about, it's not just about developing Node-RED, it's also this overall sustainability of the project. How do we keep the lights on with the project, and it all comes down to the community around it and who's contributing. And I think finding ways that we can get more commercial entities interested in actually helping further what we're doing with Node-RED is one of the paths to improving its sustainability. And I think what we can do with FlowForge is really, I guess, bring some more attention to, stop ignoring Node-RED. There is, you take your head out of the sand and recognize there is an ever-growing demand for Node-RED or tools like Node-RED, solutions like that, and you risk being left behind if you don't start participating. That's what I hope we can help achieve with FlowForge by having those serious conversations around the role Node-RED can have in industry manufacturing.
Absolutely.
Nick,
go ahead, Vlad.
I was gonna piggyback off that answer a little bit on a slight tangent. So, Nick, I'm certainly, I wouldn't call myself an AI expert, but I've seen videos of AI being utilized to create Node-RED flows, which I found quite interesting. And I think that that's certainly going to even further facilitate and kind of allow broader deployment of such flows. I'm curious, if you do have a take, maybe, I don't know if you had a chance to play with those tools yet, but I'm curious, what your thoughts are on, automating some of the flow creation through AI.
Where am I? Yeah. I think it is fun, and a lot of people are having fun with it. In fact, we at FlowForge, we have published a Node-RED function node with ChatGPT integrated. You can type in a prompt box in the node to describe what you want the code to do, and it will get ChatGPT to generate the function code for you.
Really?
In the node, which it's a bit of fun. It's one of those, I'm still trying to figure out. So one of the challenges I have with these systems is if you start relying on them wholesale, it's great when it works. It's going to be disastrous when it doesn't work, and that the system has told you what it thinks you want to hear, not what you need to hear, type of thing.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
and I think it's going to be interesting. And this isn't just Node-RED. This isn't just low code. I think the whole domain. It's how you build safety into these systems that you can recognize when it gets it wrong, because it isn't going to get it right all the time. And I think that there was some really interesting work colleagues were doing back when I was at IBM about explainable AI. So it's not just about coming up with an answer, it's explaining why it thinks that's the answer. And it's that kind of, how do you build trust in the system? I think it's fascinating to see how quickly, particularly over the last 6 months even, some of these technologies have evolved. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it almost feels like a need to have that bit of a step back and say, great, we've built a system that can give us answers that look entirely plausible. but that system has no idea if that answer was factually correct or not. It looks right. And having a system that can tell you what it reckons, you've got to build a lot of trust to be sure that what it reckons is actually what you want to hear. So anyway, I think it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. I think it is inevitable that AIs will be able to do a lot of that low-level work of those tasks. How that translates to what you and I do day to day, who knows? But I watch it with a healthy skepticism of where it really is today, but not to discount where it will be tomorrow.
I can appreciate that, Nick. So the next question I like to ask is about career advice, but instead of going into automation manufacturing, I want to ask a little bit more about open source. And I think you said it earlier, and I think kind of the number one, we'll just say pain point of most open source solutions that I'm aware of are developers going into to take the requests and going to push out known good code and add features and add graphical design and add all of that. So until artificial intelligence comes in and just completes Node-RED and then we can sit back and let it go ahead and continue to build itself, I suppose, there will be a need for people to go contribute to open source projects. Can you tell us and developers listening a good way to get started either with Node-RED or perhaps open source projects in general?
So I think it always helps to go in, find that project that you're genuinely interested in and look to what you can bring to that project. And usually with open source, it's about community and it's about conversation. So it's not about jumping in with both feet and saying, here I've spent 6 weeks implementing this feature, here you go type of thing. I think that the healthy open source projects are the ones with the healthy communities of people around them that are welcoming to newcomers who maybe aren't sure where best to get started, and are those who are open and receptive to people who want to get started. Now, that can be a challenge sometimes from my from the sort of the maintainer side, because there's nothing more than I would love dearly to have lots of people contributing to Node-RED. On the flip side, having lots of people saying, "Hey Nick, can you help me get started contributing to Node-RED?" is a separate challenge of how do we then as maintainers not put people off just because we are also busy people with day jobs and lives. So I would suggest anyone interested in getting involved with open source is find the community around that open source, just be a voice in that community, and talk to the people in that community and find your way in to maybe it's a bit of documentation, maybe it's everyone has to start somewhere, and everyone should make their first contribution somewhere. And it can be as simple as clarifying a bit of the documentation. It can be as simple as the project, a typo on the project website. Seemingly inconsequential things, but they all make a difference. They're all little tasks that other people haven't had the time to address, and it's those little things. It's about building trust. It's about building familiarity. And then on the technology side, pick something that you are familiar, you are passionate about, and again, talk to the maintainers and see if there are any particular areas that would be good places for you to get started. I like community. I think that's one of my favorite parts of the non-technical parts of Node-RED is our Node-RED forum gets like 1 million page views a month. It's super active, and it's got to the point where I don't post very often on the forum just because there are so many people in the forum. Willingly helping all comers to the forum, at all sorts of questions at all levels of ability. And yeah, again, it's a testament to the community rather than anything I've done with Node-RED. And I think it has been one of our successes of Node-RED is the people and the community we've built around it.
Absolutely. I think that's interesting. I find that if you're interested in any piece of technology and you can go find a good community, they will certainly point you. They will certainly point you in the right direction. And it's always happy to hear that it's on that 10 years after the inception that the community has come and built itself up enough that you, Nick, don't have to go live in the forums going and answering the very simple, sticky questions that all the new users have to ask. So thank you for that. One of the things that we always like to ask is for some content recommendations. And we've talked about so many different things. Vlad is going to take like 45 minutes putting all of the Node-RED discussion boards and all of that in the show notes, which will be out in podcast form after this. But Nick, kind of beyond that, do you have some good content recommendations of things people might be interested in taking a look at?
I mean, this is a bit of a complete left turn. I was trying to think, because obviously you sort of primed me with this question. I thought, okay, so what have I read recently? What do I look at? And I realized I haven't really read books recently. And I was trying to think, well, why not? I used to read a lot. And it's down to one YouTube channel, which is my recommendation, called Cracking the Cryptic, which is it's a couple of guys in the UK, and every day they post 2 videos where they will spend some time solving a Sudoku puzzle, one of the number puzzles. Okay. But they're all sort of different rule sets, and some of these videos are 20 minutes long. Sometimes they are 2 hours long. And I've kind of realized the reason I haven't sort of sat down and read a book is because in the evening, they post them in the UK like 8:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. And I'll just sit on the sofa and I'll fight, and because they're all online, so you can do the puzzle. And I find actually one of the best ways I find just to switch off and unwind my brain from the day is doing things like number puzzles, doing things like that. So, and it's just fascinating. Sometimes, and it might sound bonkers, but to spend an hour just watching someone solve a puzzle, I tend to attempt the puzzle, and when I get stuck, I then watch the video and get unstuck. But it's
wait, they solve it by hand, or this is like some algorithmic, no, it's different approach to stuff?
They are solving them. So the 2 guys, one of them is a Times crossword champ. Yeah, they are very good at doing this. But I appreciate, complete left turn, nothing to do with technology. But in terms of, I was trying to work out why I haven't read books, and it's because I spend my evenings staring at Sudoku puzzles, and I find it a great way to switch off. And this is to bring it round. One of the challenges with being an open source maintainer is it isn't a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 job, because your community isn't Monday to Friday 9 to 5. And one of the challenges has historically been just finding those times when you can switch off. And I think for me, doing something like that is one of the routes that I can switch off and just focus, use a different part of my brain for an hour, and just hit reset on a bunch of stuff. So there you go. That's a bit of a left turn on that one.
I guess I would say, Nick, I love that recommendation. I find myself going through waves of watching mostly strange YouTube videos. There are also strange podcasts that I'll listen to that have absolutely nothing to do with my normal day-to-day life. Otherwise, my brain just completely stays on. So I, from my perspective, completely appreciate that. Vlad and I have had a number of conversations of how does one go leave work at work and turn it off, and maybe that's a conversation Vlad and I will have more in depth at the channel at a later point. But I love it. I'm also desperately worried that if I start watching this YouTube channel, that will be 3 hours of my life every day. So very tempted to go click the link that Vlad has in the description and show notes. We will have to see how that goes. Thank you. But no, this has been awesome. I guess last question for you, Nick, is who should reach out? Who do you want to connect to, either on the open source side, on the FlowForge side? Are you looking for customers? Are you looking for employees? I know you're looking for use cases. This is very much kind of your soapbox, your open thank you for us sitting here and talking for almost 2 hours at this point to what can our community do to help you?
So from my perspective, if you are a Node-RED user and you have a story to tell, please reach out. If you are using Node-RED in an industrial manufacturing type setting and you think there's value in what I've talked about with FlowForge and you're interested in that, please reach out. Even if you're not, please reach out, because I'd love to hear about what problems you guys face with Node-RED. And yes, the FlowForge side, because that's the day job, but also very much on the Node-RED side of any feedback or interest in what's missing with Node-RED itself at the heart of it. So all of that type of space. We are hiring Node.js developer type roles, DevOps type roles, sales roles at FlowForge. So if you're interested in talking about any of that, please do reach out. I'm hopefully fairly easy to find on LinkedIn or social media generally, but I'm sure you guys can provide the necessary links in the notes. So yeah, and I will say I'm always open to chatting about Node-RED with anyone who wants to chat about Node-RED. So please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. So one, I think this is amazing. Two, I will say that if you do have folks coming to you talking about Node-RED applications, and we can have a larger conversation live on the internet about it, and we're not breaching any sort of NDAs, we would love to go have that conversation with end users. That is something that Vlad and I love to do. Very infrequently are we able to not have to pre-record and then send through legal and then maybe 6 months edit out 80% of the good stuff. But if there are applications, even white labeled applications that we can talk about, those are always super amounts of fun. Those are always super amounts of fun. So we will, of course, kind of extend that offering. If someone talks to Nick and has an interesting Node-RED or FlowForge application, we can go talk about it online. We would love to do it on this show to go to go talk about what those applications look like. With that, thank you everyone for coming to hang out. If you're going to be at Automate between the week of May 22nd, please come hang out with us at the Siemens booth, at the Phoenix Contact booth, at the Festo booth. We will kind of be all over. And a good part of what we want to do is see you people, the folks who we have talked to, either interviewed on the guest or talk on and chat, or kind of all of the above. So if you're going to be there, feel free to drop us a note. We would love to go connect. If we haven't met, we'd love to connect, say hi, talk about some stuff. We've got stickers and a bunch of other fun stuff. Vlad may or may not have 4,000 PLCs with him. It will be interesting to see what he comes to Detroit with. Beyond that, again, thank you to Siemens for going ahead and sponsoring this. And if you guys have made it all the way through, please feel free to like and subscribe the Solus PLC YouTube channel, the Manufacturing Hub LinkedIn page, as well as myself and Vlad and Nick. All of our contact information, LinkedIn profiles, etc., should be down below and wherever you guys are watching and or listening. So please feel free to go ahead and do that. And if you are listening on podcast form, please give us a follow. Please rate us 5 stars. We've got episodes that come out basically every Thursday, plus an extra 1 or 2 floating bonuses throughout the course of the month. I find that if I ask you guys to subscribe, you guys subscribe, and more people listen to us, and then more people find us. But until next week, we'll see everyone soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.